Look, Mom just sent me a picture when I was 10. Aw, look how cute you were back then. We're cute back then? I'm still cute. Nah, you ain't no golden Pothos. I mean, look how beautiful that thing grew into. You're more like the Pelia. Look way better when he was younger and smaller. He's just going through a bit of winter growth. You know, he just needs a bit of TLC, but he's good. Right. You know we're the same person, right? Nah, I'm the golden Pothos. You're the Pelia. Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome back to my channel. For those who's new, my name is Christian and I love plants, and in today's video I want to share with you guys how you can grow a few of your houseplants from a baby one to a large one. We're going to travel back in time and show you guys a few of my plants that I've had for a couple of years, to what they looked like back then, to then what they look like today, and share obviously the process in between and how to care for those plants so that way they can grow nice, big, and healthy. I often get a lot of similar questions about these houseplants. What did they look like when you first got them? How big were they? How did you get it to grow so big and full? So the plants we're going to cover today are a couple of Pothos, a couple of Ficus Elasticas, and a couple of Hoyas. I'm not going to go through the Pelia today. I'm going to save him for another video. He's obviously struggling, going through a bit of a winter growth, and I don't think he can handle any criticism right now. So with that said, let's start with our neon Pothos. So I first got this in the summer of 2018, and you guys can see here it was in a 4-inch container, very tiny, very small. I think it only had about 2 vines when I first got this. And in the course of 2.5 years, this is what he looks like today. Ta-da! Here he is now, 2.5 years later. You can see the stark difference of when this guy was a baby to what it looks like today. And it's grown so beautifully in the past 2.5 years. I obviously repotted this a couple of times. The first time repotting it was moving it from a 4-inch container to a 6-inch container the following year. So I got it in summer 2018. Come spring 2019, I repotted it. And then I repotted again in spring of 2020. If you guys have seen that video on how to care and repot your Pothos, I did do that and moved it from a 6-inch to now this 8-inch container that he's in. Since I've had this guy, it obviously continued to grow and trail, and I've actually cut it a few times. It should probably be longer than what it is if I didn't cut it, but I've been cutting and propagating and then planting it back on the mother plant. And that's what you guys can see here. It's got a full crown, because if you guys remember when I first got this, it only had about 2 or maybe 3 vines. Now there's probably like about 5 long vines here, and then plus all the cuttings I've just been adding, that's gonna start trailing into more additional vines. So really happy with this neon Pothos. Now I've always placed this guy very close to my south-facing window on top of my bookshelf in my bedroom. And again, when I first got it, it was a 4-inch container. Then I moved it to a 6-inch. You guys can see some pictures here. And now it's in this 8-inch container. Before I talk about and share with you guys a few of the care tips for my Pothos, I want to show you guys my golden Pothos, because I did get that a month after I got this one. Also in a 4-inch container, and this is what he looks like today. Ta-da! He obviously can't fit in the frame right now, but I'm gonna show you guys a few shots of what he looks like standing very close to me. Very tall. I have this one obviously climbing on a moss pole. Similar to the neon Pothos, I got this guy in a 4-inch container, had about 2 or 3 vines as well. And again, the following spring of 2019, I repotted it from a 4-inch to a 6-inch. And in the spring of 2020, I repotted as well from that 4-inch to the 8-inch container that they're both in right now. The difference I did with this one is I decided to actually put a moss pole to help it climb up rather than trail down. Regardless, both are beautiful and stunning, and that's one thing I love about Pothos, is you can have them either trailing down or climbing up. I do think by adding a moss pole on this golden Pothos, it did help make the leaves grow a little bit larger and bigger than you see here in the neon Pothos, as well as it felt like it grows faster and much more full. So you guys can see there is a stark difference. Although I didn't cut this one as much as I cut the neon Pothos to add a bit more on the mother plant. But yes, very beautiful, and honestly one of my favorite houseplants ever. Now when it comes to growing your Pothos, especially if you want it to grow this big and this large, is lighting is probably the most important thing. I can't stress it enough. You need a lot of bright indirect light. Although these can thrive in somewhat low to medium light, they won't grow as fast or as big as you can get them if they had a very bright indirect light. When I first got these guys, obviously 4-inch container, it took 2.5 years to grow them to this size. Notwithstanding that, they were growing throughout that time that I've had it, constantly putting out new leaves, and that's because they were getting a lot of that light. The next important thing is to make sure that you are watering your plant consistently in a way that you are not necessarily depriving them of water or you're not giving them too much water. And what I mean by that is as soon as the soil dries up completely, 100%, give it a good drink. You don't want these guys sitting in dry soil for a long period of time. Although I do think they can tolerate a bit of underwatering, I do think they thrive better in consistent watering. And that just means don't cheap out on your watering, if that makes sense. As soon as the soil dries up, don't let it sit there in dry soil for long periods of time. Go ahead and give it a good drink. Allow that water to drain through. Again, making sure that your pots has drainage holes and making sure that your potting mix is of well drainage. And I have mine in just regular potting mix, a bit of cacti soil and some perlite, and they do really well. The next thing you need to keep an eye out for when you are growing pothos, especially if you want them to be really big, is you got to make sure you are repotting your plant, especially if your pothos is actively growing through the entire year, and that includes winter. Because pothos generally do grow pretty quickly, you want to keep an eye on making sure that you repot at the right time. You never want these guys sitting in the same pot for more than 2 years, to be honest. I generally would suggest repot them once a year. You want to make sure those roots have enough room for them to continue to grow, thus creating a lot more bigger and healthier leaves. There are a few signs to tell when it's time to repot your pothos. One is, do you find that your pothos is drying up pretty quickly and needing to be watered a lot more often? That typically suggests there's a lot more roots than soil and it's really thirsty. Are the roots starting to show through the drainage holes? Do you find that there's more roots coiling around the pot? If you move a bit of the soil from the top and you're noticing that there's a lot of roots starting to show, that probably suggests that there's a lot more roots than soil, so you want to definitely repot that. Another sign as well is if the new leaves that's showing on your pothos after it's kind of grown and hardened is smaller than the previous leaf, then it's time to probably repot, especially if it's in the summer, you know, when your plant is actively growing. So you want to keep an eye and check on those roots. However, one thing to keep in mind when it comes to repotting is you don't want to also repot too early, and you don't want to repot it to a way of a bigger pot size than the roots, because what will happen is if there's more soil than roots, you will risk overwatering your plant and your pothos may struggle, may drop leaves. So you do want to be mindful of that. I always recommend to just move a size up. So for example, I had mine in a 4-inch container. The next size up that I can get was a 6-inch container, which was perfect. And then from there, an 8-inch container. Now come spring, I'm gonna pot these guys now to a 10-inch containers. So that is how I go about growing a pothos from a baby plant to a large plant. Couple things to keep in mind. I've never fertilized any of my pothos. The lighting that they do get though is south facing. So I highly recommend that you have them in a lot of bright indirect light, south facing. East or west preferred. North, they will struggle and they will not grow to the size of a plant that you can get them if they were in a south facing or east or west facing window. But yeah, so that is how I grow my pothos. It's so crazy to look back at how they were when they were a baby plant to what they look like today. And one thing to keep in mind is it's just time as well. You need to give your plants a bit of time. I know we want all our plants to grow really big and healthy right away, but there is something to be said about the process and the journey in between, because I enjoyed really growing these guys from a baby plant to what they are today, and all the in-betweens, the good and the bad. So now let's talk about our Ficus elasticas. We'll start with the Ficus burgundy. And as you guys can see here, I got it in May of 2018. It was in a 6-inch container. It had about 3 leaves already, but look how adorable this little guy was. And I think I paid $20 for this plant back then, and I remember it being my first Ficus elastica. And when I first saw this type of plant, I was like, it was okay. It wasn't my favorite when I was starting to get into houseplants, but then now Ficus elasticas are definitely one of my favorite houseplants. So this is what he looks like today. Ta-da! Look how massive this one is. So it is the same plant, and it's grown so beautifully since I've gotten it. It is now in a, I think, 11 or 12-inch container. And similar to the golden pothos, I had to repot this plant every year from that 6-inch container to an 8-inch container. And now last summer, I repotted this to this now 10 or 11-inch container that you guys see here. It's so cool to just compare this plant to what it looked like, 2.5 years ago. And as you guys can see here, I'm going to do side-by-side comparison. It's grown pretty healthy and pretty large. It probably could have grown a little bit bigger had I probably repotted this a little bit more frequent than what I was doing. And that's because this was actively growing similar to my golden pothos or my neon pothos. And what I did to obviously get this guy to grow as big and as healthy, similar to the Ficus elastica teneke I'm going to show you guys, is a lot of bright indirect light, even a couple hours of direct sunlight. And I highly recommend that if you have any Ficus elastica type of plants, you want to make sure that you have them in a south or east facing window or even west facing window. I don't recommend if you have a north facing window. These guys will struggle a bit because they definitely want a lot of that bright light. And again, even a couple hours of morning or late afternoon sun, these guys will thrive well. Now let's take a look at my Ficus elastica teneki. So this is when I first got it, similar time as when I first got the burgundy and the ruby. So it was in the summer of 2018, and I got it originally as part of this plant arrangement that was in an 8-inch container. It had the ficus in the middle and a whole bunch of other plants that I forget what it was that I didn't even like. I think it's one of those like flowering plants that typically grow in the spring. So I only went and got this because of that Ficus elastica teneki. You guys can see here, it's in this 6-inch container and it's so tiny. I think it had about like 9 leaves. It's so small and so adorable to obviously what he looks like today. Ta-da! So this is what he looks like today. He's so tall now. I think maybe about 4.5 feet tall. Definitely taller than I think the golden pothos. I'm gonna try and do a comparison on it, but very beautiful and so happy. It's grown really well under my care. And again, similar to the burgundy or similar to the ruby, these guys love and need a lot of bright indirect light in order for them to thrive and grow. When it comes to the potting soil and the potting medium, something that's well draining is very important because the roots on Ficus elasticas, I find that they typically grow a little bit more like woodier, if that makes sense, especially at the top. So unless you have well draining soil, what will typically happen with your Ficus elastica is it can get really tight in the root ball and then create a bit of waterlog when you are watering your plant. And that's what's causing a lot of the brown spots that you often see on your plant. So you want to make sure that the potting soil and the potting medium is well draining. Regular potting soil plus cacti soil plus a lot of perlite should do the trick. And again, you just want to make sure that that root ball is nice and loose and not tight, especially when you are repotting your plant. Similar to the pothos, I had to repot these guys every year, and that's because this was actively growing. Similar to the golden pothos, it did not stop even during the winter. So of course the roots were getting a little too big, a little too tight for the container, and it had to be repotted. I have a Ficus ruby that also was a very similar size to, say, the Ficus burgundy when I first got it, but however, it was in a 4-inch container. I didn't repot it for 2 years, and what eventually happened to that ruby is it's a lot smaller than these two. That ruby should have probably been bigger had I repotted after the first year. So again, you do want to keep an eye making sure you are repotting at the right time, but also you don't want to repot too early because that can also be a problem, right? So similar signs to the golden pothos or the neon pothos, just keep an eye on when it's time to repot. Is the soil drying up really quickly? Do you find yourself watering more often than usual? And are those roots starting to grow through the roots or starting to coil around the pot? Those are just signs that it's definitely time to repot your Ficus elastica. I do plan on repotting the Ficus elastica or the burgundy as well as the ruby come spring or summer to try and get them to obviously grow a little bit more. And I'm actually curious to see if we're gonna be able to notch this Ficus elastica teneki. We'll see if the Altissima notching that I did a couple of months ago is going to shoot out come spring and summer. But for now, I love the way it looks and it's so cool. If you are doing everything that I'm kind of suggesting in terms of giving it a lot of bright indirect light, south, west, or east facing preferred, and you're watering when that soil is dry and it's a well-draining soil, but your plant is not growing, like the new leaves that typically show at the top doesn't want to open up or it's just not growing, you may want to try giving it a bit of fertilizer to kind of just give it that one edge or that push. I don't fertilize my golden pothos, my neon, or any of my pothos or my Ficus elasticas. I've never fertilized them and they're doing fine. However, I do have a Ficus Altissima, and when I first got it, as well as my Ficus Audrey, it just wasn't growing. I was doing everything right, giving it a lot of bright light, watering when the soil is dry, proper potting mix, but it just wasn't growing. It wasn't pushing out any new leaves. I did give it a very simple, even base fertilizer the next time I watered it, like a 10-10-10. And since I did that one time, it finally pushed out the new growth, and from there it just kept growing with my Ficus Altissima. So you may want to try that, but for the most part, the leaves at the top, you guys should see it grow if you're giving it all the right growing conditions. If it's not, then you might want to troubleshoot it by giving it a little bit of fertilizer. But yeah, so that is how I go about growing my Ficus elasticas as well as my golden pothos. The next two plants I want to show you guys are Hoyas. And when I first got these plants, I got them as well 2 years ago, 2018, both the Macrophylla and the Crimson Princess. When I first got them, they were both in this tiny 4-inch container, and you guys can see how small these guys were. The Macrophylla only had like a few leaves, had 2 little vines. The Crimson Princess as well only had maybe about 2 or 3 vines, and since then, this is what they look like. Ta-da! You guys can see here, surprisingly, both are still in the 4-inch container, and you're probably wondering why, Christian, when your golden pothos and your Ficus elastica, you kept repotting every year in order to encourage growth. Well, some plants like Hoyas don't actually want to be repotted often. If not, they actually prefer not to be repotted every year or even every 2 years. I've heard people keep their Hoyas for 10 or 15 years in the same container. But these little guys, when I first got it, was obviously a couple of years ago. Since then, they've grown so much, produced so much more vines and so many leaves, and they're still in the same container. They're epiphytes, so typically they don't really need a lot of potting soil or potting medium, but I do have them in a very well-draining type of soil, cacti soil with a lot of perlite. And I water when the soil is 100% dry. And again, a lot of bright indirect light, very close to my south-facing window. And they're loving it. They're living their best lives. So I may consider repotting these guys come spring and summer because, you know, it does look like the roots are a little bit more root bound now. They are starting to coil, but you know, they can probably do another year in the same container, to be quite honest, and still continue to push out new growth and new leaves. Similar to my golden pothos or my Ficus elasticas, I actually don't fertilize any of my Hoyas. They can probably benefit from it, especially if you're trying to get it to bloom, but this Crimson Princess is so beautiful right now. It's nice and full. And then this Macrophylla, I just love the large leaves on it and just that honeycomb pattern. And one thing cool about these plants is you can get them to kind of change a bit of color by getting them a bit more sun stress. So that just means giving them a lot of bright indirect light, even a few hours of direct sunlight. They can definitely benefit from it. But yeah, so that is how I go about caring my Hoyas. Not too big of a growth than what you see in the Elastica or the Pothos, but nonetheless, these guys typically grow a little bit smaller, but comparing to what they looked like when I first got it to what they are today, I'm really happy with the growth. So there you guys have it. Those are just a few plants I've had for a while. And again, notwithstanding all the right growing conditions you can provide them, lighting, proper watering, and when to repot, the number one thing to keep in mind, it's also about time. It takes time for some of these plants to grow to this size. You can expedite the growth of your plants by obviously getting more of a larger plant when you first get them, but there's also something exciting about getting a baby plant or a smaller plant and watching the growth process and going through that experience and that journey with your plant, which I know I find satisfying and exciting. So don't be discouraged if your baby plant today isn't as large or as big as you want them to be. Enjoy that moment and that process, give it the best growing conditions you can get, and know that when it produces a new leaf or when it gets to that size you want it, that was your work and that's what you did for that plant. With that said, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, learned a thing or two about caring for your houseplants. Until next time, we'll see you guys soon. Peace. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Hopefully you gave it a thumbs up. And if you haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe to my channel. If you are looking for more planty content like how to care for your houseplants, click right here.